Here we see the December 11th patch version of Borderlands 4 running 45% faster than the launch version at 1080p high settings native resolution TSR on an RTX 5060 Ti 8GB. Now, part of this, I think, is due to VRAM related optimizations on 8GB cards, but not all of it. Some of it just is running faster, meaning they have done a lot of optimization work. And I've tested this out at various graphics settings. To dig into this more, I've looked into shader compilation stutters, if that's been improved. And all of this makes things a little bit awkward for the company's CEO, who famously at launch was pushing back against people claiming it was unoptimized, saying it's already optimized, stop whining and use more DLSS. Well, I mean, that's what I said in the thumbnail as a summary of his actual tweet, saying things like, "We have made an amazing and fun and huge looter shooter campaign game. The game is pretty optimal, which means that the software is doing what we want without wasteful cycles on bad processes." Wait, if it wasn't wasting cycles on bad processes, how come things here look pretty much the same and are running a lot better? In other words, I would question his take in the initial launch that the game was actually optimized. He says every gamer, a PC gamer, must accept the reality of the relationship between their hardware and what the software they are running is doing. And what I and many others were saying around launch was that, well, honestly, given what we saw on the screen, we felt like the hardware should be able to deliver better performance than what it was in this software. Also, there was tons of shader compilation stutters, which was very frustrating when running the game. Now, here's the patch notes, and in these patch notes, we do have a note from the dev team who is acknowledging all of the work they've been doing and saying they still have more to do regarding optimizing the game, saying over the past few months, the team has been investigating how to deliver the best runtime performance possible with Borderlands 4. Since launching, we've discovered a number of fixes that deliver noticeable frame rate boosts and reduce stuttering without making sacrifices in visual quality. Hey, wait a minute, I thought it was already doing what they want without wasteful cycles on bad processes. Okay, I should probably stop picking on Randy Pitchford, but he really was asking for it with all those statements. Anyway, whatever. Some of the fixes are improvements to our code or content. Other fixes come from later versions of Epic's Unreal Engine. See below for more details. However, we still have much more to do here. We're in this for the long haul, and over the coming months, we'll roll out even more performance improvements. We appreciate the community's feedback and your patience. So they are promising more in addition to what they've delivered. And this is a pretty long list of things they've delivered, but I think it's worth looking into so that we know what to look for when testing their claims, that performance has been improved. They say they've improved the performance cost of many UI elements like menus, HUD, and overlays without lowering visual quality, which makes me wonder why HUD elements and UI elements were having a massive performance hit. Like, that doesn't seem, well, maybe not massive, but if they were having a measurable performance hit, it sounds like perhaps the game may not have actually been running them optimally at the beginning. They say the game now uses profile guided optimization, PGO, which allows the executable to run more efficiently and bring large CPU performance gains. Now, I will say one thing I'm limited in here is my ability to test for CPU performance gains, because when the patch drops, I can compare this against my launch testing that I did, but my launch testing, as far as repeatable benchmark runs goes, was focused primarily around GPU performance. So I was running on a 9800X 3D CPU, so most of what we were seeing was GPU limited performance, not CPU limited performance. So I will say that that's a limit of my testing I'll be able to do in this video. They say they've encouraged smoother gameplay by reducing gameplay hitches caused by shader and PSO, pipeline state object compilation. And I will look for reductions in shader compilation stutters and stutters on your first run through the game compared to the launch version. They've optimized grass, shrubs, and other foliage by updating their meshes and materials, reducing the cost of drawing them on screen. Once again, sounds like maybe they weren't optimal the first time around, Randy. Anyway, added several GPU optimizations pulled in from newer versions of Unreal Engine, that were probably running things more optimally. Anyway, improved the performance of the lumen lighting system, improved the performance of foliage reflections in water, additional performance improvements for minimum spec PCs in areas with grass, dynamic shadows, and wind effects. In-engine cinematics now run at higher frame rates instead of being capped at 30 FPS. Adjusted AI NPC spawn counts in certain areas so enemies and NPCs no longer spawn in higher numbers than intended, improving both performance and gameplay flow. Removal of unnecessary lights, especially lights used for supporting volumetric clouds. Improvements to physics in Niagara to reduce memory leaks and out-of-memory crashes. Improvements to cloth initialization to reduce load and spawn cost time. Added new graphics options that let players turn off shadows, volumetric clouds, and fog, offering better performance flexibility, meaning the low settings can now go even lower so that if you want more performance out of your hardware, there's an opportunity to get it. At the cost of turning down some visuals. Improved how VRAM is used by reorganizing texture and memory pools, allowing the game to keep better visual quality at lower graphic settings without hurting performance. I will test the 8GB 5060 Ti versus, as well as the 16GB 5060 Ti in this video, so we can look at how much of this performance is coming from general optimizations versus VRAM-related optimizations. And they're also saying just general stability improvements. So that is an extensive list of optimizations, Randy. It wasn't optimized at launch, Randy. Your developers are still saying that there's a lot more that they can be doing, Randy. But anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at it. Has one of the worst optimized games of the year made major improvements? Well, like I showed at the beginning, at 1080p high settings native TSR, the 5060 Ti 8GB version is now performing 45% faster. In this scenario I'm testing here, at 64 FPS versus 44 FPS. If I use DLSS quality at the 1080p high settings, we can now, at launch, that was how a 5060 Ti could get to 66 frames per second, whereas now it can hit 94 frames per second at those same settings. That is a 42% performance boost. And if you look at the side-by-sides, like, I'm not seeing massive visual downgrades. I'm actually seeing some improvements that I think are optimization related, because I want you guys to notice something right now. Look at the launch version of the game. There's static shadows here as well as dynamic shadows, and they're both being rendered at the same time. The static shadows did not disappear when we got close enough for the dynamic shadows to kick in. Whereas in the current version of the game, when we get close enough for dynamic shadows to kick in, the static shadows are removed. So it looks better because the static shadows look weird when you're casting the dynamic shadows. And that's probably helping just one of the examples of where performance is being gained. And look how much like foliage is on screen here. Remember, they said they have optimized the foliage. All sorts of stuff is going on where things have been optimized. If we move up to 1440p high settings native TSR, the 5060 Ti 8GB at launch was only hitting 27 frames per second, and I'm suspicious that some of that could have been VRAM related. And now it's still not doing amazing, but it's hitting 45 frames per second, which is much more playable. That is a 67% performance increase at the same, graphics preset. Again, watch those shadows on the fan blades on the left. See there, now it's still doing that, like the dynamic and static on the left, whereas on the right, we're just getting the dynamic. Now, if we kick on DLSS balanced on the 1440p high settings, at launch, we could only hit 45 frames per second, whereas now we're hitting 80 frames per second. That is 78% faster than at launch. And I'm trying to look to see if they're pulling any shenanigans with the internal rendering resolution or anything, but to my eye, I can't see, nothing to me looks like it's being, like they're just lying, and DLSS balance is now lowering the internal resolution. Like everything seems about equally sharp as far as I can tell. Also, let me stop here. Notice that 1080p maximum settings, we were definitely hitting VRAM related issues on the launch version of the game. And you can even see these ground textures not properly rendering and loading in on the launch version of the game, whereas it seems like we are seeing these textures now. So if anything, to my eye, the current version of the game looks better and is performing significantly better, albeit still only 33 FPS. It's 94% faster, so basically doubling the performance at 33 FPS versus 17 FPS compared to the launch version of the game. And I think this is a combination of VRAM-related optimizations, where the game was spilling over VRAM at these settings in the launch version of the game, but also just general optimizations where it's running faster, on top of just being more efficient with the VRAM related issues. Now, if we kick on DLSS quality on the 1080p max settings, now the 5060 Ti 8GB can deliver a 61 FPS average in this area. So you can play the game at 60 FPS, 1080p max settings, with only compromise being DLSS quality. Whereas at launch, I was only hitting 33 FPS at those same settings. So we're running, again, almost twice as fast. This is an 85% improvement. And when I'm looking at the side-by-sides, I'm not seeing like some big obvious downgrade to the image or anything like that. Notice again that the textures are loading in on the current version of the game, but aren't on the left-hand side of the screen. We're now looking at, that says 1400p. That's a typo. That should be 1440. Sorry. This is 1440p max settings. This is native TSR. And notice that despite the textures loading in better on the right-hand side, neither one is doing well, because I think what we're seeing here is that at 1440p max settings, even with the newer VRAM optimizations, we're still over 8 gigabytes of VRAM even in the current version of the game at these settings. However, going down to DLSS balanced, still says 1400p. Anyway, 1440p DLSS balanced maximum settings. Now, the 5060 Ti 8GB is able to hit 50 FPS, which is fairly playable, not what I'd be shooting for in a first-person shooter style game, but that is almost triple the performance of the launch version, which was only hitting 18 FPS. Note that lowering the internal rendering resolution by using DLSS balanced is getting VRAM a little bit more under control, and so I think we're seeing the more performance scalability here. Now, I was curious if going down to low settings where we weren't seeing VRAM-related issues even in the launch version of the game, whether we would see any differences. And here we're only seeing a 13% performance boost. But guys, let me pause here for a second, because at high settings and at maximum settings, by the way, there's a very high in between. So really the high settings in this game are actually the medium. The maximum settings, so there's low, medium, high, very high, and then the maximum settings. So really I'm testing out low, medium, and max, if you want to think like low, middle, and max. That's what we're testing in this video. Anyway, do you notice how much more foliage is happening on the right-hand side of the screen, the current version of the game, compared to the left? One of my problems with the game's launch version is that by going down to the low settings, you destroyed a lot of what looked good about the game, like the foliage, etc. There was almost nothing there. It looked very empty, and yet still wasn't performing all that well. So notice that in the current version of the game, we get way more of the foliage, and we're running 13% faster. That being said, you can tell the image looks very different between the two sides. And what I think is happening here is that the low settings can now go lower than the original low settings. Remember, they mentioned that here. So I think what's going on is that this is because the volumetric fog has been turned off. So they mentioned that we can now do that. So I think that is probably what we're seeing. And, probably other stuff as well. But I think it's just the idea that now some settings can go lower than low. So I think that a lot of the lighting happening here, how this looks lighter and this looks darker, is because there was fog that was being hit by the lighting here, causing that to look so much lighter than what we're seeing here. But to my eye, I'm going to be honest, I kind of like the high contrast look, to be honest. Although there is something to be said for more of the kind of, atmospheric effect that you get here. So I will say at the low settings, there is a major difference visually between the old low settings and the new low settings, compared to where at high and max, I struggled to see any differences despite the increased performance. Here, I like the trade-offs we're getting. I would say this is a more optimal choice of what to do with your resources. Yeah, give me the foliage. I can live without the volumetric fog. I'm running 13% faster, and I see more stuff on the screen. To me, the increase to the foliage is worth any loss to that kind of fog. And again, also running faster while we're doing it. So I think that's probably explaining the visual differences here. So 1080p low settings, native TSR, 80 FPS at launch, and 90 FPS on the current December 11th patch. That is a 13% performance improvement. Now, if you go down to 1080p low with DLSS quality, I'm actually seeing an 18% performance improvement at 141 FPS versus 120. Again, we're seeing those big differences between the images, but like I said, for me, having the foliage, show more, to me, what looks like a more detailed looking game, I think is my preference here. And like I said, 18% faster. There's some pros and cons to the image, but my personal preference wise, I prefer the right-hand side, and it's running faster. If we move up to 1440p at low settings, native TSR, the launch version of the game was running below 60 frames per second here at 56 average. And the new version isn't like mind-blowingly faster, but it is 14% faster at 64 FPS, which is 14% faster than the launch version. Same kind of visual differences we're seeing between the two. But notice that if you want to play this game at around 60 FPS at native resolution, no upscaling, you can now at least do that on a 5060 Ti 8GB, whereas at launch you couldn't be above 60 FPS. At native 1440p. Now, if we use DLSS balanced, the launch version of the game could run low settings at 100 FPS, and the current version of the game can run it at 109 FPS. So we're 9% faster in the new version of the game, while also, like I said, getting a lot more of that foliage and everything. So definitely a lot of differences on the old low version preset and the new low version preset, but yeah, I think it's worth it, in my opinion. It's nice to have those settings that can go lower than low as well. Now, I need to stop for a second because notice that I have switched graphics cards. We are now on the 16 gigabyte version of the 5060 Ti. Once again, I'm comparing the launch version to the current patch. Because remember, while we had this big list of optimizations, some of them were about improving VRAM use, which means that some of the performance gains we've been seeing so far are because in the launch version of the game, we may have been spilling over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, causing massive performance issues, whereas the current version of the game isn't, and that's part of what we're seeing. But remember, there were lots of optimizations listed that were not VRAM related specifically. So that's what we're looking at here. By testing out the 16 gigabyte card, we can now check how much optimization performance increase we're seeing here isn't VRAM related. So 1080p high settings DLSS quality, the launch version of the game was running at 79 FPS on the 16 gigabyte 5060 Ti, so not held back by VRAM. And on the December 11th patch, we're running at 93 FPS, which is an 18% performance improvement. So the high settings are running 18% faster, even if you already had enough VRAM for running the game. Now, I'm noticing slight differences between the two images. The lighting looks a little bit different. Remember, they did say there was lumen optimizations and things like that, but I think it's certainly worth the improvement. Now, I'm noticing that the maximum settings in the game do not seem to be delivering as much of a performance improvement as I was seeing at the high settings when we have enough VRAM. Now, I think this would make sense because if the maximum settings in the game are just the maximum settings, they don't necessarily want to tune things. They just want to let you turn all the Unreal Engine sliders all the way up because it's maximum settings. I guess it would make sense why there was less optimization here. It's running 5% faster at 60 FPS versus 57 at launch. Now, looking at the low settings, Once again, I didn't think that the performance improvements we were seeing were VRAM related because low settings weren't going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM at launch. So we're seeing similar performance improvement to what we saw on the 8 gigabyte card. We're seeing 136 FPS on the current version compared to 119 FPS on the launch version. So that is a 14% performance improvement. Again, not VRAM related, but like I said, in the low settings, we certainly see some very big differences between the what the graphics actually look like. Again, I did test out that they have no longer 30 FPS capped the cutscenes. Also, I'll note some menu changes where now when you switch graphic settings, it will actually pop up a compiling shaders like percentage warning thing here, so that when you change graphic settings, you know that it is actually compiling the shaders and you know to wait, so that's actually complete. Now, to be clear, in my testing, after changing graphic setting preset, I did completely restart the game to be sure that everything applied and shaders were compiled. Another thing I wanted to look at, though, is how they have claimed to have worked on shader compilation improvements for smoother gameplay, as well as PSO, so pipeline state object compilation. So one of my biggest complaints about the game when it launched wasn't just that it had overall kind of lackluster performance. It was that the game stuttered constantly. So what are we looking at here? On the left-hand side of the screen, we have me booting up the game on a fresh install of a graphics card driver, fresh shader cache, and then running through that same area again. What are we looking for? If the shader pre-compilation misses some of the shaders, then what will happen is as you're running through the game area, the first time you encounter a shader, it will have to compile, and that can manifest as a stutter. You can see it on as a frame time spike on the frame time graph, and we can also keep an eye on the 1% lows. That's this third FPS number, the lowest 1% of frames since starting the average. So if we run this, note that when we compare these frame time graphs, while neither one is perfectly smooth, I'm seeing many more small stutters on the left-hand side than I'm seeing on the right-hand side, indicating that shader compilation wasn't maybe entirely complete on the first run. But that being said, I think it is running significantly better than it was at launch. So even if shader compilation isn't perfect on the pre-compilation step, this is just a gameplay run fighting through this little area on a fresh shader cache install. And notice that the frame time graph here isn't perfect. It is absolutely not perfect. That being said, when I tested this area out at launch, there would be massive frame time spikes down to like single digit FPS in the 1% lows, where like the first time an enemy would come on screen or or like a shot would be fired, the game would almost freeze for a noticeable chunk of a second. It completely took me out of the gameplay, whereas these spikes are much more minimal, and notice that the 1% lows are still, close to 60 FPS. Now, granted, I'm on a 9800X 3D based system here, and slower CPUs may have longer shader do have longer shader compilation time. So I would say that the frame time graph isn't perfect here. The run 1 versus run 2 indicates that shader compilation is probably still not perfect, but I can confirm, compared to when I tested the game out on launch day, that I'm seeing no absolutely takes me out of the experience level stutters in this initial area, whereas that was absolutely the case when the game launched. So where are we at with things? I think we can confirm that the game developers really have implemented a massive number of performance optimizations since launch. And it's especially noticeable if you were playing the game on an 8 gigabyte graphics card at anything above the low settings, and I mean, I guess I didn't test out medium settings here, but remember, high is the actual middle graphic setting. So if you're playing the game on high, very high, or max settings and trying to do it on a graphics card with 8 gigabytes or less, which to be clear is the majority of people on the Steam hardware survey, they have done a massive amount to help you out. But even if you already had enough VRAM for the settings you were playing at, the overall performance is better. And like I said, their adjustments to the low settings, I think, have, in my opinion, made the low settings look better because you see more of the foliage, etc. And I like that you can bring down the volumetric fog, etc. So overall, I would say this is a massive step in the right direction. Even if I agree with the developers that they still have more work to do here, I'm glad they say they're in it for the long haul and are promising more improvements. I don't know whether I'll do any further videos, but it's nice to see that this has improved significantly. It also backs up what I was saying at launch, that their CEO, Randy Pitchford, well, if there weren't any wasteful cycles on bad processes here and the game was optimal, the heck is all this? I hope all of you have an excellent day.